checking my clock on the wall, we do have time, and that's what we needed, a time for, I was thinking if we had a theme music for our program tonight, it might have been that old song, Staying Alive, because Michael talked about the COVID, and now we're a healthy leader, and it may not sound like it, but I think it is appropriate to use Staying Alive for Dr. Charlotte Naugle's speech, and you will understand why when we get to the end of her introduction. Charlotte Naugle was a district director in our district, and she's well on her way to being a district director in District 100. So she certainly has exposed the concept of being a healthy leader and a leader amongst us. So not many of us in this history of our district have been district governors or district directors of more than one district. So that's quite something. Her theme, believe it or not, and Charlotte doesn't know this, when I competed recently in the International Speech Contest, my basic theme was her title. Freedom Isn't Free is the title of her speech. Dr. Charlotte Naugle will present an updated version of Freedom Isn't Free. Dr. Charlotte's adventure in Cairo, Egypt for 8 years were interrupted by the Arab Spring and the effect it left on her. Dr. Charlotte has been a Toastmaster for 18 years. She is currently serving as Program Quality Director, nominated to be candidate as District Director for District 100. Her career of over 45 years, including serving as a teacher, principal, and university professor. She has lived in 4 foreign countries and with her military husband and her children. And staying alive is, if you must keep your freedom, you want to stay alive and healthy. Freedom isn't free. Dr. Charlotte Naugle.
Thank you so much. Let me prepare quickly I didn't have a chance to do this ahead of time. So just bear with me for a minute and we'll get going. Oh, I lost my camera. Just a second. I'm sure that you know people who have died to give us freedom. Do any of those deaths mean anything to you personally? Death through wars, civil disobedience, racial discrimination, or maybe police brutality. These thoughts were not especially important to me until I had my great awakening while living in Cairo, Egypt during the Arab Spring. I arrived for a very creative life experience in Cairo in 2005. For how long, I didn't know. I had to come and see why I was even there. I held on to my round trip ticket for a year, just in case it didn't work out. But I ended up staying for 8 years. I set foot on the tarmac of Cairo International Airport. A very strange feeling came over me. I felt like I was at home. I thought to myself, I think I might have been Queen Nefertiti in my past life. I immediately fell in love with the city and all that it offered, the smog and all. After a few weeks of living in a hotel, I found my 3-bedroom, 2-bath apartment on the 2nd floor, near downtown, right on the Nile, in a neighborhood called Do'i. Now, welcome to Do'i, my neighborhood. I roamed these streets without a care in the world, looking for an adventure, often saying, here I am, Cairo, What do you have for me? And I soon became an active member of this community. I was taking Arabic lessons and having fun trying out my new language, which often caused the Egyptians to laugh at my American accent. I also learned how to hang clothes on the balcony clothesline without dropping anything. Now, this was a skill, let me tell you, and a very different way to live. But oh, what fun I had. Egypt is a very highly developed, effective police state. There were policemen everywhere. But because I was a guest in the country, the tourists were important to the economy, I was treated extremely well. They often helped me cross the street and get to subway stations, or maybe even watch my driver's car if it was needed. However, they didn't seem to show that same respect to the Egyptian people, which I found very unsettling. Now, it didn't take me long to acclimate myself to the Egyptian life, and I was having a splendid time. I spent many hours cruising the Nile in riverboats and feluccas with KFC and chicken, and singing loudly with a recording of the famous Egyptian pop star Amr Diab. I was also traveling through the Middle East and Europe with the Egyptian ballroom dancing team and had lots of fun doing that. In addition, I was teaching as the only American professor at Cairo University with graduate students who were working in international businesses, completing their degrees in business management. This was the top for me. This was why I was in Egypt. I was sure topping this would be hard. I love spending time with Egyptian people. They were loving, kind, care, and accepting. And although I had many friends, 2 families accepted me as part of their family, and I had the opportunity to learn much about Egyptian life. Meet the El Basha family. I met them through their son, Ahmed, who was a student in my class. I spent many hours learning about living on limited resources. Amina, the mother, and I squatted on the floor, often cooking a full-blown Egyptian meal on a Bunsen burner. I was impressed, since I even have a hard time cooking on a regular stove. But they accepted me unconditionally. Another family that I was very close to is the El Dali family. They lived in a village about 30 minutes outside of Cairo, and I met them through a friend who also lived in their village. They introduced me to village weddings and Egyptian dancing, making visits to the mosque, and the kids even tried to teach me how to ride a donkey. That didn't go so well. Mustafa, the father, he owned a cyber cafe within the village, which served great Egyptian tea, coffee, or shisha, the bubbly machine pipe that they used for smoking tobacco. My life was full of newness, joy, and fun. I was a carefree spirit, living in a carefree world, having the time of my life. thinking, now I know why I'm in Egypt. I love this. Then one day, everything changed. It was Monday, January 25th, 2011. The police day holiday around 11 o'clock in the morning. I was sitting very peacefully on my balcony, watching the boats on the river, enjoying a cup of Egyptian coffee when I heard loud chanting in the street. I got excited and thought, oh, here comes the Ahli soccer team. They must have won another game. They often invited me to join them in their victory marches, and they were fun to be with. But wait a minute, I listened closer. A large group was chanting, Kafaya, Kafaya, enough, enough. Their voices were angry and defiant. As they turned the corner to pass in front of my apartment, I saw hundreds protesting, carrying flags and placards. I shouted down to them, Inta Reafin, where are you going? They responded, El Medan El Tahrir. Tahrir Square was a beautiful park in downtown Cairo. Tayali, Doctor, Tayali, come with us, doctor. La shukran, no thank you. Anadurs Hena fi Masri, I'm a guest here in Egypt. What was this all about? What was happening? I hadn't heard anything about protesting. Now, I didn't go with them, but boy, was I curious and wanted to learn what was really happening. People continued to pour into the streets, and they took over the entire square, and it became the epicenter for the protesters. Now, I waited all day. Should I? Shouldn't I? Should I? No, I probably shouldn't. But by evening, my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to wander through the park to see the action. Groups were having discussions. Some were singing, others giving speeches, and some had even settled down for the night. I kept wandering from group to group, asking, Intafin, why are you here? Inta Izek, what do you want? What is happening? And this is what they told me. We have let Mubarak run our lives long enough. We want your American democracy. Now, the responses had a distinct undercurrent of bitterness and shame, while mixed with the euphoria of empowerment. Mubarak treats us with contempt and disrespect. We won't leave until he goes. We don't see any hope if things don't change. We want change. The police are going unchecked and they're killing people. Look at what they did to Khalid Said. Khalid was a young man from Alexandria. For no apparent reason, he was pulled out of a cyber cafe in Alexandria and beaten to death by the police earlier. I listened to these comments all evening. These people said their words with such a sense of defeat 1 minute, but hopefulness the next. This night was a profound experience for me. The thought entered my mind, wow, freedom isn't free. There's a cost to this dream. And I've been taking my own freedoms for granted. On January 27th, all cell phones went dead. The internet was shut down by the government as social media was being used as a call to arms. I was now without contact with my family in America. Oh my God, what was I going to do? I really, an eerie feeling came over me because I was used to talking to them once a week using Radio Shack's Magic Jack. But now I felt completely disconnected. However, the closing down of the internet backfired on the government. If people couldn't use the internet and get their information, they flooded into the streets to find out what was really happening. Once they were outside, they then joined the protest. And as a result, the internet was restored in a couple of days. And boy, let me tell you, I was relieved because so much was happening. On the third day, the police abandoned their positions from the lowest rank to the highest. They just walked off the job, saying they were not going to take orders that required them to turn on their neighbors and their friends. Following day, the camel battle emerged. Now, I witnessed these camel riders coming through the squares with whips and machetes. I couldn't move. I was watching from my balcony. I watched dumbfoundedly while over 300 Egyptians in this square lost their lives that day, with many injuries occurring. I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. This can't be real. But yes, it was real and people were dying. Now I definitely knew, without a doubt, that freedom is not free. There was a question that I kept asking myself during this time. Was I willing to die for my American freedom? That question continued to haunt me, and the crowds became larger and larger and more violent and horrific. Tear gas canisters from the United States were used for control. Looting and burning were becoming more prevalent. And they even looted the sacred Egyptian museum. The army was called in. A curfew was set for 3 o'clock that afternoon. Soldiers were told to shoot on sight if they saw anyone out after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I heard later that 2 men from my building disobeyed that order and were shot and killed. Wow, I said to myself, this is really getting serious. Then the tanks rolled in. Their sound was ominous, and it felt like a rumbling earthquake. They positioned themselves around the area, and one tank had the audacity to plant itself in front of my apartment building. I looked eye to eye with that huge military tank, and I said to myself, how dare you invade my space? Then immediately seeing that young soldier and remembering what he had been ordered to do, that whole thing gave me a grave sense of foreboding. my belief was strengthened again. Freedom isn't free. Now, the one hopeful action I saw during all of this fiasco was how Christians surrounded praying Muslims, protecting them from the police as they prayed in the street. The Muslims then followed in return, protecting them on the Christians' holy day. The intriguing aspect about this scene for me is that these two groups have been at odds with each other for centuries, most of the time. But when danger came, they were there for each other. And through all this chaos, this was a very sweet moment for me. And I thought, this is how freedom can look. I had not planned on returning to America because I really thought the turmoil would not last. But at the end of the second week, the American embassy called and told me that the last plane to America was the next day. And if I wasn't on it, they could not guarantee my safety. Oh dear, that means I have to go home. I packed my one bag, closed up my apartment, and reported to the airport with all the other evacuees going to their home countries. There were more guests living in Egypt than I had thought. I was finally escorted to an empty hangar where I waited with 200 other Americans for 6 hours to be evacuated. We waited wearily and waited. We were finally told we were going to Frankfurt, Germany, and we would be responsible for finding our own way home from there. Eventually, we boarded the plane, but sat on the tarmac for another 4 hours, and the pilot couldn't tell us why. We were just waiting, he said. As we were boarding, I saw our luggage into the holding area of the plane. But shortly after that, it all unloaded again. Real fear began to set in for me. Oh God, they found a bomb, I bet. I must have said it out loud because someone across the aisle responded, oh, maybe it's in a suitcase. Another voice yelled, I think they took a terrorist off the plane. Now, a horrid idea began to creep into my mind. Oh my God, we're sitting ducks on this tarmac. Somebody out there could blow up this plane full of Americans while we're just sitting here. I had to bolster up a lot of courage and work at calming myself for several hours with silent prayers after hearing all these comments. Thank God my prayers were answered because we had no bombs or terrorists. We flew to Frankfurt, where I lived for 3 days, trying to get a flight home to Los Angeles. But that adventure is for another speech. I eventually arrived in LA and was relieved when my feet hit American soil. I stayed home for 2 months, but my heart was really in Egypt. I hoped the revolution was successful. Mubarak was out, and that was a good sign. But I yearned to return to my apartment and see my famous river. I learned that Egypt had not been successful in their attempts to gain freedom. The university had not reopened, which meant that my job was gone, and I didn't know what had happened to my students or where they were. The military had moved into power and was running the government. It was now a military state, and army personnel were everywhere, and they were watching. I tried to pick up my life from where I had left it for one more year, but the tourist trade had dropped to zero. No one was coming to Egypt. Dancing was limited only to Cairo. All travel in the Middle East was stopped. I located a few students, but they no longer were working either. The world I knew in Egypt had changed significantly. Remember the two families that I was close to? They were heartbroken, disillusioned, and expressed hopelessness that I had not ever heard before. The village was quiet, with people only going out for necessities. All the usual celebrations were now being held indoors with only family attending. We know what that is like. The cafe was slow. Everywhere people were guarded. Again, I was reminded, freedom cannot be taken for granted. It doesn't come easy. It takes belief and work. I finally decided that my time in Egypt had come to a close. I packed up my great apartment, looked at the river, shipped my belongings home, but I said goodbye to this famous river for the last time and this amazing city and left. I still have contact with many people in Egypt and have learned that the military is still in control. The amazing fact, however, is that there are still risky anniversary protests that are being done on January 25th. They're not giving up. These galvanizing memories of this experience has changed me forever. The Arab Spring challenged my thinking, my belief, my attitude about my own freedom. As an American woman, my concept of freedom was nebulous and floating somewhere out there in the ether until January 25, 2011. I know now why I had to journey to Egypt. My mystery was solved. So I'm challenging you this evening. Take heed of my great awakening lessons. Think about these three questions. Are you willing to work for our freedom? Fight for it? Die for it, even if we don't succeed? These are important questions because it is my belief we could find ourselves in a similar situation. And I want you to remember always that freedom isn't free. Mr. Master of Ceremonies.
Thank you, Charlotte. This, I think, is an example of exactly why Speakers Bureau exists in my mind.